Hallo und welcome to Gegenpressing, the Bundesliga podcast. I'm Manu Hier is Stefan Bienkowski. This is the main show, I guess. It is Monday. It was a long weekend, Stefan. I was on the road. The Deutsche Bahn mostly worked out for me, except until the very end, when I had like a horrendous time getting back from Stuttgart to Munich. But I made it. I'm mostly awake. How's it going with you over there?
Good. Should we let the listeners in on your travel plans and the fact that you maybe overlooked one small factor about your plans on the way home?
Yeah, so in the Deutsche Bahn's defense, this may have actually not been their fault this time. I've had a very good run over my last 3 or 4 trips that all my trains were not only on time, but ahead of schedule. And that was the case on this trip until I tried to get back. And, I finally managed to get on this train in Stuttgart. And I'm like, yeah, I texted you and I'm like, it's been really crazy. Like all these trains that are coming from the north, they're all delayed. And you're like finally saying to me, like, have you not watched the news? I'm like, what do you mean? Most of Northern Europe has been battered by storms for 72 hours. Most of Scotland doesn't even have electricity. And I open the news and half of Northern Germany is flooded and there's no power and there's tree branches on train tracks. And yeah, it dawned on me that would explain, because usually the way it works, right? The trains that go from Stuttgart to Munich, they start somewhere in Hamburg and then they go make their way through the entire country. So if there's a branch somewhere up north on a train track, that means that every train that goes through Stuttgart is delayed. So yeah, that kind of was an enlightening moment for me. And I already thought it was odd of you when you asked me, when I was sitting on the press tribune, he's like, "How's the weather?" I'm like, "Well, it's raining. There's a little bit of rain. I don't know why you would ask such a weird question, but you're British, so I just shrugged it off." So
yeah, I just got back from visiting my parents for lunch, and even the trip from Glasgow back to just north of Stirling, where I live, was pretty hellish. So I did think of you in some Swabian stadium, getting harassed by gale force winds, but you got home and in. But that's a kind of interesting little insight into like our world. Like I think people obviously think, well, maybe they don't, maybe they don't think about it at all, but I think obviously people maybe think of us going to football games and how glamorous it is. We get to rub shoulders with these stars and stuff. 9 out of 10 times it's sitting in a cold stadium, or once you've kind of finished all your work, walking out of a cold stadium into like an empty, parking lot, no trains, no buses, usually in the rain, pitch black. I had this distinct problem actually. I was at Anfield last year for transfer market. And by the time we'd finished all the media stuff, I walked out the stadium because the Champions League game, so it was like close to midnight, and there's just nothing getting you back to the stadium. So I had to I luckily managed to get a taxi back. But yeah, and like I said to you at the time, there's nothing worse than after a football game being stuck at a train station because you missed your train home, or you're waiting for some connecting train. But you got back in the end. That's the important thing.
yeah, I did. That is the most important thing, and I finally was able to read up the weather updates for most of Northern Europe. And there was hail in Frankfurt, there was hail in Stuttgart. I'm like, yeah, the weather's a little odd, but it's October, it rains. Now in retrospect, I was actually pretty lucky that it always hailed when I was either in a train or inside the stadium.
Or in a beer tent.
Or in a beer tent, yeah, at Oktoberfest. But here we are. I did survive and I did make it back. I have a little bit of a cold, so I did suffer. This is the other shitty thing about this time of the year. It's in where I live in Canada. It's basically 25 degrees from March until the end of October. And here it's really hot in the summer and then it drops, right? So this is the first time this year. It's the first time since March that I experienced cold and wet temperatures, and it gets me every year. Every year, I come to Germany every year around this time, and every year I get sick because I'm used to just still wearing t-shirts and shorts, and it goes straight from t-shirt to shorts to yuck, it's 5 degrees and rain.
Yeah, it's very dramatic because obviously if you were staying in Canada, you'd get the gradual change in weather. But obviously, yeah, you're right. It's something that catches me off a lot when I go to Germany as well. The first time I went to Germany years and years ago, I was like 21 or 20, was a trip to Munich. I was going to the Klassiker way ago. And I got off the flight and there was 2 feet of snow. And it was probably like literally this time of year, because obviously it's when they usually play the Bayern Dortmund games. And I was in a t-shirt and I was in like a t-shirt and a denim jacket. I had to go straight from the airport to a H&M to buy like a huge like waterproof jacket.
Well,
to wear
here's how traumatic it is. And we'll get to the football in a second, I promise. But when Oktoberfest started, it was 30 degrees. And now Oktoberfest ended yesterday and it was 10 degrees when I got to Munich.
Yeah. Was that 3 weeks it lasts?
2 weeks.
2 weeks, okay.
So, and that's normal, right?
Yeah.
So you arrive with t-shirts and shorts, and then like you experience that traumatic change to winter while you're here. It's crazy. This is why I always laugh when people say that you have to get used to the bad weather at Stoke when you play in the Premier League. Trust me, nothing is as bad as here. Which gets us to the Saturday games and the horrendous weather. Let's do this in chronological order. The main kickoff was Dortmund against Leipzig. A great game of football. I caught this in various trains and taxis making my way to the Waldstadion in Frankfurt. I did catch the full game. It is, I thought, on balance, and we'll get to Bayern Munich and their dominance and the way they've been playing in a moment. Bayern Munich probably the great winner of this match, right? Because both Dortmund and Leipzig end up dropping points. I think on balance, even though I think Leipzig was slightly better, it's a deserved draw. I thought it was a fantastic game to watch. The pace was very high. I think Leipzig look like a very different side now than they did on matchday 1 when they got absolutely smacked around by Bayern Munich. And I thought too that Dortmund looked very much like a top team. The level was really nice. It was great to watch. Stefan, you had a bit more of a convenient standpoint to watch this from home. What were your takeaways from this game?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. It felt like a game that, as you said, excuse me, both sides probably deserved a point ultimately. Going into the match, I was kind of expecting probably a more dominant performance from Dortmund, just considering what we've seen in recent weeks. They've done very well in the Champions League. They've done very well in the Bundesliga. They looked very much kind of in control in games, but I think it was quite telling that Leipzig came out of this game, or started this game very strongly. They started it really kind of came racing out the gates, and they put Dortmund under a lot of pressure very quickly, and obviously scored first with, a fantastic goal, very Route 1 goal, really. But you can see that Dortmund perhaps weren't quite ready for that level of kind of intensity from Leipzig, and Dortmund then go back into the game. They score a goal, a nice goal where, Guirassy kind of lays off the ball, and it's a well-worked goal. And at that point, you're kind of thinking, okay, this is maybe Dortmund waking up. They've kind of, they've had a poor start to the game, but taking back control of the match, they're kind of working the ball across the pitch to score it, and then they go and score a goal. But then, Leipzig then score a goal almost immediately later, which is very narrowly ruled offside. And I think that probably was a good way of kind of summing up the match, really. It felt like for every attempt Dortmund made to try and control this match, Leipzig showed an ability to kind of, break that press, go Route 1 if need be. And they certainly had the players to kind of cause a lot of problems to Dortmund. And perhaps the first team to really kind of, I think, question Niko Kovac's tactics and his system, really, in two ways, really. The first one that stood out to me was I thought Leipzig actually did a really good job on Dortmund's midfield. So Dortmund obviously play that 3-4-3 system, which means the two midfielders, are really up against it, to be honest with you, especially against modern teams where most teams tend to play a back three. We had, obviously, Felix Metscher in there and Marcel Sabitzer, who have both had really good starts this season, but they were up against Ouedraogo, who obviously did very well, Baumgartner, who I thought best game I've seen him play for Leipzig in a long time, and Sival as well, who I thought was also very good. It felt to me like, literally like Leipzig had an extra man in midfield for a lot of this game. It really kind of felt, tactically speaking, that Dortmund struggled to control the match because Leipzig were kind of winning that midfield battle. And, I think, obviously, Kovac tried to make some changes to that over the course of the second half. Julian Brandt came on for Adeyemi, who's a bit more of a kind of attacking midfielder rather than, out and out forward, because the first half, he had Bayer and Adeyemi playing off Guirassy, who are basically two forwards. So it's not as if one of them can fill in as a number 10 or attacking midfielder, but it felt like they were outnumbered in that regard. And it's the first time I've really kind of seen Kovac's 3-4-3 system this season get pulled apart that way. And the other one as well was and I've said this before in the show, where the way that Kovac's Dortmund team set up is that they're very kind of tactical. They've got a very solid kind of back line. They've got a very solid midfield. Even the front line's very kind of practical in the sense that, Maximilian Bayer's there. He's basically there to just run around the pitch all day. He's not there to be this finesse player. He's not, he's not Erling Haaland. He's not Kylian Mbappe. He's Kevin Grosskreutz in a sense. He's there to kind of chase down and harass midfield defenders and offer some sort of ability to pull defenders away for Guirassy and Adeyemi, who are the two kind of guys who are creating chances. When that doesn't quite work out, Kovac has had a lot of success this season with bringing Julian Brandt off the bench, and he kind of does a lot to kind of win games because he's playing against tired defences. He's also still a very good player. But it's still a system that I think that's very reliant on, okay, we're very hard to break down, we're very hard to score against, but we rely on kind of individual talent in one or two or three players to kind of do something special. And I don't mean really in the sense of like no one else is helping. I just mean like that's predominantly where all the goals and assists come from. And it felt like in this game, I thought Guirassy, I know he got an assist technically, but he missed a great chance in the second half, I think it was. Excuse me. I just had a salami and sauerkraut sandwich at lunch, and it's just sticking up the back of my throat. So apologies for all the coughing. I did think Guirassy was particularly sharp. I thought Adeyemi wasn't perhaps as productive as he has been. And then, Julian Brandt comes on to save the day, and there's only so much he can do. So that aspect of Dortmund's kind of plan didn't quite work out either, I thought. And, by the end of the game, Manu, I thought it was actually Leipzig who were in the ascendancy, to be honest with you, and probably could have scored a second goal and won this game. So, yeah, I think a point's a good result for both teams, but I think Dortmund, maybe more so than Leipzig, would have been happier with it because I think Leipzig could have probably quite easily won that game.
Yeah, and maybe should have, right? That is the takeaway from this game, perhaps that that the way that they played and the way that they controlled the match at times, they should have maybe won this game. Of course, it's difficult. Signal Iduna Park, it's a very difficult place to go. And be to win games like it. The Romelu goal, just slightly offside, of course. But I really thought it's interesting that Ole Werner, the way I mentioned this before the game, right? Niko Kovac has never beaten him, and that continues. So he is quite adept in working out at his tactics against him. But just in general, when I looked at this lineup, this is the 4-3-3, and that seems to be his preferred lineup now. And he's very much bought into that. I'd be really, really curious to hear what the conversation was like after that 6-0 defeat on match day 1, right? And when Jurgen Klopp had to go up to Leipzig and sit down with the coaching staff and the players and discuss all of these things. And I'm really curious what the conclusion out of that was, because since then, Ole Werner has very much nailed down that formation, right? That 4-3-3 with the midfielder Baumgart and Seiwald and Ole Werner, who now 2 games in a row he's starting. He's finally showing. I interviewed him last summer when he signed for Leipzig, and then of course he spent the entire season struggling with injuries. And he's finally coming to form, nominated for the U21 national team. So that's really great to see. That front three, Romelu in the middle, flanked by 2 fast wingers, whether it's Nusa or Jan Diomande, who comes on, right, and Bakayoko. And I think what you notice there is that you have the center forward, a number 9, right, which is a clear move away from the double striking system that they had with Jesko and Openda last year. There's a clear number 9 now in the system. Then you have 4 players who press the opponent's defense, right? You have Baumgartner, Ouedraogo, Bakayoko, Nusa in this case. If Diomande plays, then it would be him. Konrad Rada is another player who can do this really well. But these are all players that are fast, they're dynamic, and they're very athletic. And there's a clear handwriting and a clear thought and pattern here that, they looked at this system they looked at the way that Leipzig played last year, and they said, like, we have to go back to a system where we're a high pressing team, where we're a hard working team, where we put pressure on the opponent's defense at all times. From what I've seen over the last few match days, that's been really working, and I think that is a big difference than from what you saw last year or the year before that, even, where you had you 3 or 4 attacking players in Openda, Šeško, and Javi Simmons, but they all were kind of like doing their own thing, right? They weren't playing within a system, and there's a clear handwriting now, and there's a clear identity when you think about Red Bull football. Ole Werner is very much putting that on the field at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we'll come on to Bayern and how Frankfurt played against them. And, I know this isn't maybe the best way to describe or promote the league, but I do think sometimes clubs do look at Bayern on the fixture list and just think it's a day off. No one's expected to do anything. So we're going to lose that game. We accept we're going to lose it, and they go into it, accept and lose it. And I wouldn't be surprised if Leipzig did that at the start of this season, because obviously it was so early in Ole Werner's time at his club. He had a whole squad of young players. He still wasn't maybe entirely sure who should be starting, what system, what formation, and that showed on the pitch. But they've come a long way since then. You're absolutely right, and you're right. I think I said after the game, with every passing week, it feels like RB Leipzig are doing better and better and better. I think you could probably make a decent argument that they obviously benefited from not having a midweek game like Dortmund did, and I think that's something we'll probably talk a lot about this season, in the sense that that's a huge advantage that Leipzig have over the likes of Frankfurt and Leverkusen and Dortmund and Bayern, I suppose, to extent as well. And, they looked like a far, far fitter team. They looked far more energetic than Dortmund in this game. So we have to take all that into account. But no, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think it's going to be really interesting to see how, Ole Werner's reputation changes in Germany this season, Manu, because I still get a lot of Werder Bremen fans in my mentions on social media being like, "Oh, we didn't sack him; he chose to leave," and all this stuff. And I thought, well, yeah, technically, but it was gently nudged out the door by the club, and there were certainly plenty of people in the Werder Bremen stands demanding that he left. Because of the fact that he just refused to play young players, and it was obviously grating. But he got results, and if he does continue to do well at Leipzig, then, we'll be very quickly looking at one of the most exciting young managers in German football.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that a lot of Werder Bremen fans don't have time for him, and he's at a club where the rest of the country hate. So, it might be this kind of weird situation where most German football fans have to begrudgingly accept that Ole Werner might be a decent head coach, despite the clubs that he's played for in the past. You know what? So far, so good. Yeah, aside from that Bayern result, they've done very, very well. So, I guess we'll have to see how far they can go this season.
Also in that Bayern game, there was still Louis Openda, there was still Javi Simmons, right? And you had to play them to keep the market alive for them. It was the most inconvenient of times to play them, right?
Yeah. I mean, you make such a good point, though, about like Openda and Javi Simmons, and even Šeško to an extent as well. Like, we spent the whole summer talking about how Šeško wasn't a finished product, and fine, whatever. He's gone. Best of luck to him in the Premier League. But with Openda and Javi Simmons, 2 players who absolutely had probably already proved that they were good enough for Leipzig, proved that they were ready to make the next step, and proved that they were waiting for that next step to show up. And you're right, this whole front line with Leipzig is completely changed. Yes, they've still got some old players in there, but you're right, you look at that entire front 3, Bakayoko, Romelu and Nusa, there's 3 players who do have to prove themselves in the Bundesliga, especially Nusa, who obviously didn't get a chance to do that last season. Tival, I think, still has a lot to prove. Odrago is still learning his trade there. Baumgartner, not so much, but I think he just comes across as a very kind of he's like Kevin Campbell 2.0, or the way I described him in our subscriber chat as Marcel Sabitzer Jr., in the sense that like he's just a solid pair of hands in the Bundesliga. He's happy to do a shift. Yeah. He's not really angling for a move to Manchester United or Chelsea, is he? So it's a far hungrier Leipzig side, isn't it?
Yeah, and Romelu looks like a far more finished product than even Šeško. Maybe not as high of a ceiling, but he just looks like he's far more of a finished product. And yeah, you're right. I mean, like, we'll have to see where this goes. I mean, Dortmund too. We haven't really talked about them yet, but they get a point here. Of course, now they have to win the Spitzenspiel or the Klassiker after the international break to keep Bayern close by, but this is a game that maybe they in the past would have lost, right? And Kovac is so very good at getting the results against games where maybe they're on a bit of a back foot. So wow, it's interesting. Both these clubs are really interesting. I mean, they both still remain in touching distance to Bayern. If Bayern do slip up, if they ever do slip up, that remains to be seen. Let's move on to this Bayern game. I was in stadium and I had some hopes that this would be a bit more of an exciting encounter than it ultimately turned out to be. The main reason it wasn't is because, Eintracht Frankfurt basically slept through the first and the second kickoff because their kickoff had to be repeated. And Luis Diaz scores within 15 seconds. Then Ritsu Doan seemed to have made it interesting. The handball in the build-up. I think personally I'm okay with the call by the referee team in Siebert. What bothered me about the call is, and I saw this in the replay on Sky Germany after the match, is that they had a referee cam for this game and Siebert had clear view of it. And if he sees it and he deems it not to be a handball in the moment live, I don't think this is a reviewable play. And he, admitted as much in an interview post-match. So it's too bad because maybe at 1-1 this would have been a different game. But then Kane scores, and again, this was a moment where Frankfurt were very sleepy. Theate does not do enough to close it down. As good as that goal is, as precise as the shot is, as great as Kane has been, but you gotta close him down. And in that moment, the game was over, right? And then Luis Diaz makes it 3-0 late in the second half. At that point, people asked me, oh, your match report is out early. That's because it was written at halftime, Stefan. I admit as much. It was just a matter of adding a final thought and some details about stadium attendance and etc. A risky thing to do, I admit it, because that can also backfire. It has backfired for some of us in the past, but it worked out this time. But yeah, if you concede after 15 seconds, one of the fastest Bundesliga goals in history. I'm curious if you know who scored the fastest.
I haven't got a clue. Arjen Robben.
Yeah, it's Karim Bellarabi and Kevin Volland. 9 seconds.
Yeah, Kevin Volland was recent, wasn't it? It was last season?
No, it was 10 years ago. He was still at Hoffenheim.
I thought he did something similar. Maybe it was the
And then Bellarabi, Musiala did it in 15 seconds last year.
Yeah, I mean, I'm struggling to think of any positives to say here about Frankfurt. I mean, you were at the game, you were in the stadium, so you saw a lot more of this because obviously one of the great benefits of being at games in person is you can watch how teams set up across the whole pitch rather than just kind of focusing on what the camera shows. And sometimes that's really invaluable to how teams set up. But we've spent the whole part of the season so far talking about kind of Frankfurt's kind of really poor defensive work, and obviously that was always going to be on show against Bayern Munich, or they'd have to be at their absolute best against Bayern Munich. But I thought in this game it showed a kind of different kind of aspect. And we've spent the whole, I have anyway, spent most of the season complaining about Robin Koch, and we talked about Theate and how he's not doing very well, and the goalkeeper's just not up to much either. But I got to say, watching those goals back, and actually, perhaps the best example of this was Harry Kane's offside goal, where Michael obviously plays him through. But then, as you said, the Kane's other goal, which was a tremendous goal from the edge of the box. Absolutely, there's only so much you can do about that. He's a world class player. He's going to score goals like that from time to time. But it felt to me like, yeah, okay, that first goal, it was. I mean, that in itself, actually, I thought was quite interesting because I don't know who it is, but I think it's maybe. I'm not quite sure who is holding Theate back. Maybe it was Olise, maybe it was Gnabry, but someone's kind of holding Theate back from actually getting to Harry Kane, who heads the ball down. It's almost like a kind of like rugby move or something. But
it was Koch.
Yeah. But the point I'm trying to make here is that for the Harry Kane offside goal, but also for his actual goal, if you look at the amount of space that Bayern's midfielders were getting, not for the pass that leads to the goal, but the 2 or 3 passes before that. It's absolutely criminal. I really do urge anyone to go back and look up the highlights on the Bundesliga YouTube channel and watch Michael Olise before that Harry Kane offside goal, and he's standing there with the ball in the centre circle, more or less. he just stands there for like 5 or 6 seconds, and everyone's just standing off him. This guy is far and away, Manu, the best playmaker in the Bundesliga right now. And Frankfurt are just sitting looking at him, dumbfounded as to what to do. And the exact same thing happened for Kimmich in Kane's actual goal, where there's no one around him. He picks out, I think it was Olise, he picked out who then plays the ball to Kane to score that goal. Let me just double check very quickly. No, Diaz, sorry. And like Diaz is just running between the spaces. No one's tracking him. No one's putting pressure on Bayern's midfielders. No one's putting pressure on the defenders, which is fine because obviously they're Bayern Munich, so you don't want to leave space at the back. But the problem is that Frankfurt still play a relatively high line, so they're playing a high line, but they're not playing a high press. So they're just kind of squeezing themselves in and letting the likes of Kimmich, Goretzka, Upamecano, whoever, just to pick these guys off and pick out their passes with all the time in the world. And it felt to me like, Manu, like we're watching this Frankfurt side in real time really kind of struggle to transition from one side of football to another, you know. And obviously, sometimes when a team scores after 15 goals or 15 seconds, you just kind of think, right, okay, well, this game's obviously just not going to go to plan. Everything we've been preparing for the last 2 or 3 days just goes completely out the window. But I think there's few teams in Bundesliga who needed this international break more than Frankfurt, because they need to get back to the training ground. They have to figure out what they're going to do next, because the tactics that they had last season just have not worked at all this season with the players that they've now got. And I really rate Toppmöller. He's proven that he can play attacking football. He's proven he can play defensive football. He's very adaptable, which is what I like about him. He's going to have to find another tactic. He's going to have to adapt again, because the system that he's got does not work with the players that he's got now.
Yeah, you're right. A couple of things. I think what really hurt them was the fact that Christensen went down with an injury. I think a couple of weeks now, right? It was in the Champions League. I think that was a hard player for them to compensate for. They sold Tuta, very influential centre back, who they haven't really replaced. And I spoke to some people at Frankfurt, and the reason the replacement didn't work out, they were very, very much behind signing Ko Itakura from Gladbach, right? And unfortunately, he picked Ajax instead. And I was thinking when I watched this game, it's like, boy, could they use Ko Itakura in this defense right now, right? Just someone who's more stable, who can put the foot on the ball, can play well from out of the back, and that's exactly what's missing. That's what they lost in Tuta, and they don't have that now. Theate is too much head through the wall, and Robin Koch is a solid defender, but he needs a partner who's good with the ball on his feet. And as I watched this game unfold, I was thinking, it's like, boy, if they had signed Ko Itakura, I think they'd be in a much better place. And I understand that this is something that they want to fix in over Christmas, that they want to find an alternative. I'm not sure why, when Itakura moved to Ajax, why they weren't able to pivot fast enough. It's rare that Markus Krusche makes a mistake, but I think they did make one there. We hardly ever criticize Frankfurt's transfer policy, because it always works out so well. But going into the season with a defense this thin is, in my opinion, criminal. I want to point out something positive, because you mentioned Michael Olise. Not his best game, I would say, and the stats underline this. He was pretty much kept quiet by Nathaniel Brown, who I thought was one of the very few players in this Frankfurt defense that were brilliant. Nathaniel Brown won 75% of his direct duels against Michael Olise, left him pretty much off the pitch. Unfortunately for Frankfurt, there's 2 or 3 other guys in the Bayern team that can score plenty of goals, right? And there's only so much you can do as a left back. Brown spoke to the media after the match. Tried to be excited about being called up to Germany, but hard when you just got beaten up 3-0, right? But I thought his performance was outstanding, and he will go to the national team with his head held high. But that's just not enough if you're the only one in that back four playing at top form, and everyone else kind of letting you down. And this is the issue too. Like, it started with that first goal. You mentioned it, like the way that Bayern were able to work in that goal, and then the center pairing is completely headless, and Diaz completely left wide open on the right there. It's just it's just the way that defense works at the moment is not good enough, Stefan. You still muted. There you go.
There we go. No, absolutely. I think I was just checking there as you were talking there, like you look at that kind of midfield and say who should be the guy in there kind of fixing things, and it is Skiri. And it's quite interesting that last season in the Bundesliga he was averaging 1.21 blocked shots and passes per game, and this season that's down to 0.53, so less than half the amount of blocked passes and shots that he's making this season. Now, it's not all down to him, obviously. I think I do genuinely think it's a system problem. It could even be a fact that they're not as attacking as they used to be, which sounds kind of paradoxical, but last season they had so much more firepower up front, obviously with Marbush and Hugo Ekitike, and that naturally means teams have to sit back, be more defensive, be more obviously aware of the fact that Frankfurt have that firepower to really hurt you, which takes more pressure off that defence. And, I think Burkhardt's great. I think Ritsu Doan's great, but I just don't think they have that same presence yet, or that same reputation yet that scares defences. And it means teams are a lot less fearful of this Frankfurt team. So there is a lot more pressure on that midfield and that attack. So guys like Larson, guys like Skiri, they're having to do a lot more work, and it's just not really working out, So I am reluctant to kind of blame any individual person right now. And yes, they are missing guys like Tusa as well to an extent. I still think the goalkeeping position's a huge problem. But I'm going to give Toppmöller and Frankfurt the kind of, not the benefit of the doubt, but I think they think he deserves it. I'm not suggesting they should sack him, obviously, but I think they deserve to see what they could do after the international break. If they come back from international break and it's still these same problems, then, I think we might have to start questioning what's going on there. But, look, Manu, a defeat to Bayern's not going to make or break Frankfurt's season, and that's probably not the fairest game to kind of really hammer them about their defensive problems. But it just felt like a lot of the issues we've seen at Frankfurt this season were definitely highlighted in this match. And and Bayern were fantastic. You're right. I mean, you're absolutely right about the way that Olise was kind of kept quiet on that right hand side. I think it's quite telling that for the assist that he would have got for Harry Kane's offside goal, he's basically standing next to Kimmich. He has to move right into the middle of the pitch and come deep for the ball. So he's obviously was having to come elsewhere. But it's all well and good if your fullback's doing a job on someone, but if your midfield or your wingers aren't doing it either, then Bayern have the ability to just move players around the pitch, and they'll find eventually. And obviously Diaz did a great job of that as well. So yeah, it's a good win for Bayern. More concern maybe for Frankfurt.
Bayern were brilliant, before we transitioned over to Stuttgart and they went over Heidenheim, and they were absolutely outstanding. The way that they play football, it's so cohesive at the moment. With Kane up front too, and sometimes the way he drops deep, and he's definitely added another dimension to his play. Luis Diaz, we criticized his transfer in the summer, and I do still worry about his long-term viability. But, you can also counter that point by saying what is Liverpool missing at the moment is one of those players that can press in the attack, right? He does all these things for Bayern Munich really well. He puts so much stress on the opponents. It's very hard to defend against. He obviously fits in so well with Kane and Olise. When you watch it live, it's a joy. It's a real pleasure to see it live. Having the system come together like that. And I fear for opponents once Davies and Musiala come back. That I don't see a better starting 11 in the Bundesliga, and I don't think I see one in Europe at the moment, right? With the troubles that Liverpool are going through, Real Madrid are not cohesive, maybe PSG. They're a good example. They have maybe a bit more depth in the attack. But, if they can keep up this level and if they don't struggle with injuries, I was thinking is like, who's going to beat them? This could be a treble winning season for them, Stefan.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not quite
fit.
Yeah, it's, I just think it's so hard to gauge this Bayern team right now. I think they've got a lot of things going really well. I think you're right. Kompany's got so much right. Olise's firing all cylinders. Diaz has had a great start to the season. Harry Kane wrote a piece for Transfermarkt over the weekend explaining why his kind of role at the club's changed slightly. He's now playing a kind of more kind of number 10 role. He's getting so much out of that. Best numbers he's had in the last 10 years. So That attack is still absolutely spot on. I still think that defensively speaking, they're still a wee bit all over the place. Obviously, as you said, they're still missing a lot of key players. There's only so much Konrad Laimer can do every game.
He's tremendous, Stefan. He's a tremendous player at the moment. At the moment, he's tremendous.
Yeah, of course. But I mean, I wouldn't want to rely on him at left back in a Champions League semi-final, for example, and but no, you're right. Right now they are literally probably the informed team in Europe right now, and there's no doubt about that. I think you can kind of contextualize that by saying they've beaten a lot of Bundesliga sides who haven't been great, and include Frankfurt in that regard. But they can only beat what's in front of them, and they pulled apart Chelsea pretty convincingly there, who obviously won at the weekend as well against a good team. So yeah, I think as things stand, Bayern Munich are definitely probably one of the best teams in Europe right now, and it's up to either the best of the Bundesliga, which might be Dortmund after this international break, or the best of the Champions League to show what they can do. Yeah, Kompany deserves a lot of credit because Bayern have been, after what was a really kind of crazy summer transfer window, they've done really well.
Yeah, and young players that do well too, which is a good transition to Stuttgart because they beat Heidenheim 1-0. Which doesn't seem to be a lot to write home about, but I looked at the Bundesliga table and there they are, Stuttgart, 4th. Not the greatest start, they started the season with just one win out of the first 3 games, and then they went on a little bit of a run of 3 games in a row that they won. Very, speaking to people at VfB, they were very upset on how the game in Basel went. Which is, of course, a match that they feel they should have won. Looking at the highlights, Marvin Hitz, former Borussia Dortmund, Augsburg, and Wolfsburg goalkeeper, standing on his head to prevent Stuttgart from winning that game. And there was a sense in the first 45 minutes that there was a real hangover from that Basel game with this VfB team. Heidenheim came to Stuttgart, the capital of Baden-Württemberg, having only one thing in mind and getting maybe a point. There's two rows of 5 around the penalty box and just trying to destroy, and giving the ball to Mikkel Kaufmann and hoping for the best that he could maybe score on a counter. I looked at the stats at halftime. I think it was 12-1 shots on goal for Stuttgart. So, that tells you everything you need to know. And, it almost worked. The Heidenheim almost did frustrate Stuttgart off the field until Bilal El Khanous, an absolutely incredible goal. There was 4 guys standing around him trying to hack him down, and he finds a way to shoot from outside the box, a low shot through all those defensive legs and pass goalkeeper Dianat Ramay to make it 1-0 and win the game. And yeah, I looked at him and I thought to myself, they lost Woltemade and he's not 100% the same player. He plays as a number 10, right? But he has that ability. He has that ability in tight spaces. He's very quick. His ceiling is, in my opinion, very high. And, they might have just had a good hand in finding a player that can actually fill that Nick Woltemade void really well for them. And yeah, that's the difference right there. And they get the 3 points into the international break, going in 4th place, Stefan. I think if you had told Stuttgart that's where they would be at this stage of the season, I think they would have taken that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we were talking about them being in real trouble not that long ago, and our newsletter is saying their season might have been ruined due to the fact they sold Woltemade. And you're right, they've maybe potentially found someone who can step in there, not just for Woltemade, but for Dennis Undav and for a lot of other players in that team who have kind of maybe fallen by the wayside ever so slightly. Wasn't that long a recent episode we talked about, for example, Thiago Thomas coming back to the club and whether he could potentially be that match winner for them. It hasn't quite worked out for him yet. And there's other guys like Chris Fulrick who I think is kind of slowly but surely kind of drifting away from the limelight, which is really interesting. Yeah, so far this season it has kind of been the El Khanous show, really, to be honest with you, for lack of a better term. His goal was outstanding, and he was exactly the kind of player I think you needed a game like that, where, as you said, Heidenheim were so happy to kind of sit deep and just kind of really kind of push Stuttgart to kind of come at them and find a way to kind of unlock that defence, and it took something from him. And I'm really intrigued by how his career has gone so far, because obviously he came through in Belgium at Genk, didn't he? And did really well there. then moved to Leicester City, who were an absolute basket case when he moved there in the Premier League. But also, I mean, he did okay. He got 2 goals and 3 assists in the Premier League, which isn't bad, in about 2,100 minutes. So not bad. But I think you can actually see it in already in the Bundesliga for Stuttgart, where he is a very slight player. He's a very finesse player. He's a very technical player. He likes to kind of almost like a ballerina through a battlefield in a sense, like kind of dance by defenders. And he's obviously very good at it. But I don't think that kind of worked very well in the Premier League again for a Leicester team who are obviously up against it. They need kind of grizzled veterans who can kind of get stuck in, hold on to the ball, not lose it. And, you know, in hindsight, it probably wasn't the right move for him to go from a club like Genk, who obviously do very well in Belgium, tend to win games, tend to dominate games, to a team like Leicester, who were basically the equivalent of Heidenheim in the Premier League when he joined them. But he's now moved to Stuttgart, and this game was perfect for him because he could attack and attack and attack. And I think you're absolutely right. Stuttgart obviously have this tremendous ability of not only just finding young players, but finding players who maybe have dropped off ever so slightly. And then it's almost like buying stocks. That's what Stuttgart are good at. They buy like commodities when they're at the lowest, and then they find a way to kind of get them back. And you can absolutely see, I mean, if I'm not mistaken, Manu, there's a kind of set fee, isn't there, in the clause in his contract?
It is a conditional obligation to buy, which is, of course, the new catchphrase of the 2025 summer transfer window. 25 million euros, which I'm pretty sure Stuttgart will happily trigger or have triggered when he triggers it. I think it's probably goals, which he should be getting pretty quick. He's already on 2 goals in the Bundesliga. There will be more coming. I think, the point that you raise is a really important one, because very often players like El Canoes go to the Premier League, to clubs that are the equivalent of Heidenheim, because they have the same amount of money than top teams in other leagues, right? But then they have the issue that, these clubs, they're signing finesse players. They're signing Ferraris to win a dirt track race in the relegation battle in the Premier League. And so, it'd be the equivalent of, we talked about this in great length, at times Heidenheim, Paul Wander struggled at Heidenheim last year because of the needs of having to stay and fight relegation. So that you're not always going to play your finesse players. You're going to play the players that are willing and ready to fight and with tooth and nail, like in Heidenheim case, you Mikkel Kaufmann, who can run, for 20 hours if he needs to, right? And so that's a real issue. So you have these players that just don't work out in the Premier League because they just sign for the wrong clubs for financial reasons, right?
Yeah.
And then they go to a club like Stuttgart, who play good football, and they are most of the time the better team in the league, right? I would say, they are top 6 team, so most of the time they're the better team, or the team that has the ball on their feet. Like yesterday, it was 65% possession. They are going to play against teams that are like Heidenheim, sitting very deep with 2 defensive lines, especially in Stuttgart, where there's 60,000 fans in the stands. There is an expectation in Stuttgart to play progressive, attacking football as well. So with all of that in mind, it's not that surprising that El Canoes is doing better in a place like Stuttgart than he did in Leicester.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's a tale as old as time. Stuttgart kind of pick up these players, and I do feel like sometimes these kind of smarter Bundesliga clubs kind of have to do this with obviously the amount of money in the Premier League now. Yes, they lose a lot of their players every summer, but it also means that the players that kind of get chewed up and spat out by the kind of meat grinder in England can usually be picked up for free, or not even for free, but for very little. And El Canoes could prove to be exactly that. And look, maybe he's not adapt at playing for the Premier League. That doesn't mean he can't be a very, very good player in the Bundesliga. No reason why he can't be a star in the Bundesliga. Yeah, you're right, Manu. Stuttgart had a very wobbly start to the season, but if this now means that El Canoes has kind of maybe cemented himself at number 10 and can kind of go forward, and we saw how quickly Voldemade went to stardom. If you'd be a fool to bet against Stuttgart and El Canoes at this point, considering what's come before them at the club. So it's really, really exciting. Yeah, it's good to see Stuttgart kind of climbing back up the table.
No, absolutely, and it's also good timing because the news just comes through that Demirovic picked up a knee injury and will be out for 8 weeks. I understand Dennis Undorf is going to be back soon, so hopefully he can fill that gap. But yeah, Stuttgart looking good. Maybe some final thoughts on Heidenheim. I think they have to do a lot better especially for trying to actually play rather than just sit back and defend all the time. Because the way that they played against Stuttgart, I don't think it's going to be good enough to keep them in the Bundesliga. But yeah, overall, good news for Stuttgart. Now they just have to figure out the train station and get people home on time to Munich. And I'd be very pleased about everything else. But yeah, it was a joy being there. And my newsletter actually tomorrow is going to be on switching spots. Because I was on the road and I got some quotes and stuff, so we're switching spots. So I'm gonna do actually something on Kema, who we didn't mention this show, but I think a couple of weeks ago, Kema Andres, the very very exciting young Spanish midfielder, and Sebastian Hoeneß actually mentioned him. We talked a little bit to him about his performances for Stuttgart and his ceiling, etc. So yeah, Stefan, lots of things to come. Also, on that note, it is the international break. So keep your eyes out for the podcast. It may come out at different times as we are filling the void for topics as everyone is off. I'm going on holiday to Italy on Thursday. Prior to that, we're probably going to do a couple more podcasts, but we'll see how things turn out, Stefan. Yeah, that's it. Unless you have any final thoughts.
No, don't think so.
All right.
Enjoy Italy.
Yeah, we'll speak before that. But until next time, auf Wiedersehen.